Welcome to episode 2. I'm really excited for this episode because I think it's going to provide a lot of insight as to why exceptional students don't always get exceptional scores on the SAT or the ACT. And this actually is such universally applicable advice. These are principles that just apply to almost every student who's taking the SAT or the ACT. So these insights are going to help you understand why your testing goals, whatever they may be for your school, why you might not be hitting them, and how to approach testing in a way that is going to help you set your students up to get the scores that reflect your school more accurately. So, just to start with, the reality about the ACT and the SAT is that these exams are testing a very specific way of thinking and of working under time pressure that is not explicitly taught in most classrooms. And I'm going to talk about why. There's a couple reasons, and some of them are quite surprising and very, very fixable. They're these insights just help you completely shift how you approach students who are taking the test, their parents, and making plans for how your school can approach these tests in an efficient way that those scores then more accurately actually reflect the preparedness of your students, right? The foundation for a good ACT and an SAT score is solid classroom experience. That's what the ACT and the SAT draw on. But it's not the only thing that students need. Almost every student, there's some students, they go in and they're going to do well on the test regardless because they think exactly like a test writer thinks. But that is a very, 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 very small percentage of the population. That being said, classroom preparation is essential because the way of thinking that makes you successful in the ACT and the SAT, that's part of prep that comes specifically for the ACT and the SAT. The way of being able to maximize your points in a specific amount of time. Those are test specific prep. But if students don't come from a strong background, they're not they're not going to increase their scores as much. And so that's actually great news because you have a school with a great curriculum, right? That's you know that you're just wanting your these students that you know are very smart, they're very capable, but you have higher goals for overall SAT and ACT scores for your cohorts, right? So the first thing that I'm going to talk about on the test is reading. And the ACT and the SAT differ on this in an important way, but there's certain principles that apply to both of them, and both of them need to be approached strategically. Whether your school focuses on the ACT or the SAT, it's important to have knowledge of those specific tests in order to best equip your students for success. So, reading. The test rewards strategic reading, not literary analysis. So I'm going to just say that again so it sinks in a little bit. The tests reward strategic reading, not literary analysis. To put this in a way that really empowers students, the answers are in black and white on the page. They're not drawing on outside information. They're not coming up with creative solutions. A lot of students come in with a lot of creativity, and that's wonderful, and it's really encouraged in our English classes across the United States, but it's not what these tests are looking for. These tests are looking for the ability to look at a very specific text and to find certain pieces of information and to understand how that text is put together. So a lot of classes teach students to appreciate nuance, to bring their own perspectives in, to infer meaning by drawing on outside facts and knowledge of the world. Like you might know something about a period of time in history, right? Who was in a position of power in the government, or what was the economic situation like, and use that to enrich the text and to build on it. But that is actually going to distract students from the information that's on the page. So instead of doing that, instead of building this kind of external world and drawing it and building this interaction with the text, all of that needs to stay outside, and the student needs to be engaging only with the text that's right in front of them. So the tests, the ACT and the SAT, they both reward students who can very quickly identify the evidence in the text that answer a very narrowly defined question. So maybe to say this in a different way, students are taught to come in with like a really open perspective, to draw on outside information, to interact with what the meaning might be, to come up with different explanations. Whereas the tests really focus on identifying evidence that is there in black and white on the piece of paper, not a sophisticated interpretation. So the exam's point is reading with a purpose of being able to say, okay, I understand where to find this piece of, I understood the question that they're trying to ask and where to find that piece of information. So what always comes to mind for me is if you were to read an instruction booklet for how to put together an IKEA desk, right? You're trying to find the part, you're trying to do the first step, right? You know to look for the number 1 or the first part on the page. That's literally as black and white as these tests can be. Some of the questions are going to ask more about general questions, but they're still not drawing from outside information. And in fact, those questions can be really well answered after the other questions have been answered. So success on reading comes from strategic reading for specific pieces of information, not literary analysis. And your teachers may be doing a phenomenal job of creating students who absolutely, they can do these things. They just haven't been doing them, and they haven't used their vocabulary skills, which are really important, and their attention to detail, their ability to read quickly in this type of context before. So they need to practice it, and they need to know, okay, we're going to shift approaches a little bit. So that's core. I see students' points increase by, for example, on the ACT, they can jump a couple of points just in a couple of sessions just by shifting how they approach the test. Let's talk about math next. So for math, translation from math class to the test. There's 2 things I want to talk about for math. One is genuine content knowledge. So actually knowing, for example, how to deal with exponents, or being familiar with what a parabola looks like and that it has 2 x-intercepts. These are content knowledge that a lot of students do need refreshers on. And the beauty of these tests is that there is a limited number of things that students need to learn. But to students and to parents or people who haven't obsessively analyzed every detail of the ACT and SAT, it can feel endless. It's like, where do I even start? The beauty is there's lots of phenomenal preparation materials out there that narrow it down to what the test really is looking for. You know, what algebra topics are they going to be asking about? What quote unquote advanced math topics? What parabolas are going to be showing up, or what graphs are going to be showing up? So content knowledge is essential for the math. But a game changer is calculator usage. Or on the SAT, it's called the Desmos calculator. So a lot of students might know the math but haven't learned how to execute it under exam conditions. And those exam conditions are: one, knowing how to use the most efficient way to answer a question, because one question you might be able to use the quadratic formula. Like you'll have to do some factoring, and then you're plugging it into the quadratic formula, which is long and messy, and there's so much room for error there. Or you could have just put the formula, put the equation into Desmos and found the x-intercept. 30 seconds max versus like 2 minutes or longer, plus much more room for error. Using a calculator is essential on this test. And a couple other skills I can use to estimate, for example, to knock out several answer choices. It's all about being able to be strategic. And these are skills that are super valuable later on if somebody were to go into engineering, for example. These tests allow you to pick different approaches and to see, okay, well, if you look at this scenario that we're putting here for you, this math problem, do you only see this one way of solving it, or do you see this other way of solving it? And if you see the other way of solving it, which students can learn with practice, right? There's repetitive questions if they're practicing over the course of a period of time, over multiple practice tests, or with a book that has practice questions. They start to see these shortcuts or these other ways of thinking about math concepts. So it's not that the test writers are asking about these just to be sneaky. These are genuinely good approaches to math. But the downfall for students is they think, okay, well, I know an approach, this should be the right way of doing it, when in fact there's several roads they could take, and they just haven't familiarized themselves with those roads before. So Desmos usage or calculator usage is key. Estimating is a really, really, really useful skill. So being able to look at the answer choices and say which of these answers is just not realistic based on context. And choosing a faster valid method when it's there. The other thing is the content knowledge in the context of the test. When you take a test with a certain teacher, you're familiar already with their teaching style. You kind of know how they're going to ask questions, especially maybe the first test of the year is new, right? It's like, oh, okay, that's not how my last math teacher used to test me, but now I can kind of see, do they ask for open-ended answers, or are they giving me answer choices to choose from? Do they draw from the textbook? Do they draw from their lectures? This is a test written by an unknown teacher. They've never taken a test from this teacher before, right? Which is why practice tests are so helpful, and also tutors or them use self-studying from books that teach them how to think like the test writers are thinking. So for a lot of students, they might know a skill, but they've never seen it in these long word problems before, which can be very, very overwhelming and can take a lot of time. So familiarity is their friend. So we've covered reading and we've covered math. English. Let's talk about English. There's a lot of skills that are the same from the SAT and the ACT. There's just a limited number of core grammar skills that the test writers really, really care about. And often I find that students just don't remember them. I personally remember being in an English class where we were learning all kinds of grammar skills, and I wasn't into it, at that time. Funny thing is now I'm very into grammar because I teach it and I find it very empowering to unlock grammar skills for students and get them points that way. But I do remember sitting there and just being like, okay, what do I need to learn to get past this test? And then I forgot about as much of it as I could because I was like, ew, I don't really like this. But I really only remember one class where we heavily focused on it, and it wasn't junior year, and it certainly wasn't senior year. It might even have been freshman year. I don't remember. Regardless, a lot of students who come to me are not familiar with the grammar rules that the tests are testing, or they've forgotten it, or they never really fully learned them. They just kind of got through those lessons in school. And that might not be the case at your school. Your school might have a particularly high population of students who are very familiar with punctuation rules. And let's see, what kinds of things? Comma rules in particular are a big thing that gets tested. Subject, verb, agreement, modifiers, things like that. But a lot of students just need a refresher on them. And then they need to be able to determine what exactly are the test writers looking for in this environment. And once they know a large number of the grammar skills that are being tested on the test, it's a lot easier to actually narrow that down. So English is one where a lot of content mastery can be very, very helpful. There are, however, questions that show up where understanding a couple techniques can make it a lot faster to answer the questions. Like, okay, you don't need to read a lot of information for all of these, but for a transition question, you gotta understand the context. And that's really important for students to learn, because then they're not wasting their time reading extra content on questions where it's not necessary. But they do need to look at the transitions questions and look at the relationship and actually pay attention to the words, right? For a lot of grammar questions, you don't need to really understand the meaning of the sentence. You need to understand the structure. So students need to switch a little bit back and forth between those types of questions and the types of questions where you do need to be paying attention to what's happening in the context. So English is one where teaching concepts can be really, really, really empowering and help increase scores. So maybe in your classes, you can have a grammar review close to the tests. That could be a way to allow students to recall some of those or ask questions so that they get a better understanding before they take the test. So yeah, all right. Well, we've covered reading, math, and English. I'm really just trying to make this as demystifying as possible. So actually, on the note of especially English and math, those small content gaps, for example, let's talk comma rules and stop punctuation, like a period or an exclamation point or comma fanboys. And then on the math section, maybe some algebra skills. They use those relatively small content gaps, when you understand what percentage they show up on the test, can have outsized effects on the score. So students don't need to be spending a ton of time just trying to study everything. If they can identify, okay, this is where I have a content gap and it's important on the test, and I can do a little bit of focused study, or a reasonable, whatever amount of focused study really helps get them from not getting those questions right to getting a larger percentage of those questions right. This is why a lot of my students have barely any homework during the week and they make huge score improvements. A student who got a 5-point increase in 7 sessions with no more than half an hour of homework a week. Another one who, after 5 sessions right now, has made a 6-point increase with same situation, somewhere between 20 minutes maybe and 40 minutes of homework a week. It doesn't have to be this overwhelming thing, but when you're able to diagnose exactly, and that's what I do at the beginning of every series of sessions I have with a student, I look at, okay, what are they getting right? What are they getting wrong? And then we just focus on those things. We just dial it in and go slow, because the whole point is not to cram their very overwhelmed brains full of more information. I know they can't take that in. So we focus on one thing, we learn it, we check it off, and then they go home to practice it. And we do that. And I'm saying this to encourage you. I'm saying this because your students have learned so much and they deserve a good score. They deserve to feel proud of themselves. And I think a lot of the time, screen turning off here. Yeah, a lot of the time students can feel, oh yeah, it's still recording. Wonderful. Can feel frustrated, or they feel like maybe they're not intelligent because they didn't get a great ACT or SAT score, or the one they were expecting, or the one that they need to get into the college that they want. But those big score improvements I was talking about, they happen with my students who start at like a 17 or an 18. And they happen for my students that start at a 27, 28. Those these principles are test prep specific principles that apply to a C student and they apply to an A student. They're just empowering, useful ways to apply the knowledge that they have and bridge the gap between their academics so far and these very specific tests, right? And it's really okay. My phone is telling me it only has 20%. That's plenty. We've gotten so much good content here, and I really hope this has made you feel a lot like there's useful things you can use here to prepare your students or to look for the right support for your students, to know that even if they're not getting the scores that they need, it's very solvable. It's just a very solvable situation. And then finally, let's talk about efficiency. So efficiency on these tests is a skill in its own right. It is a game changer. And one of the ways to get to efficiency is familiarity. And that does not mean doing a ton of practice tests. For some students, that can work. For the students who are learning as they go, not for the students who are just like stressed doing tests, who are just like doing one after another, and they're just, they're kind of in a loop. They're just kind of in a rut. They're just like exhausted. They're just trying to do more and more and more and more. They're not genuinely learning. Those students need the opportunity, permission, the space to say, it's okay. We're going to get you a score improvement. Slow down. Let's look at what you have and exactly what you want to improve. Because there's a solution. There's skills to do this. There's ways to do this. And if the let's just figure out where the gaps are and then solve those gaps. That's really all there is to it. And that's not to take away from how exhausting and how hard these tests can be. And there are students whose experience with the test can be much, much, much more frustrating than for others. And I'm not diminishing that at all. There's just an infinite way that human brains work, all of which are immensely valuable. And that being said, so many students are well served by these techniques. And so back to efficiency. The ACT and the SAT reward speed, because if you can get to more questions and you can get them right, you get more points. It's also technique to identify, okay, I'm not going to get to all the questions, so I'm going to identify from my practice the questions that don't deserve my time and attention because I know where I'm getting my points. I'm going to do that. I'm going to guess on the rest. Somebody who knows the test well and who is well prepared can do that, right? And in some sections, ordering matters. Which questions are you going to do first? Momentum is important. So if they can start with questions that are easier for them personally and where they can gather points, that allows them to save brain space for ones that might require a little bit more thinking. Yes. Okay. So student, yeah, because you don't want to have the situation where a student knows how to answer a question, but they just didn't have time for it. So time practice is very helpful. But even more helpful than that, or I guess essential in tandem with that, is learning these other approaches that I was talking about for reading, math, and English that help them tackle the questions, because then they just have a lot more efficiency and they can figure out how to move through the test effectively. Strong classroom foundations are essential for success. That being said, if a student hasn't had the most success in classes, or maybe they've missed class, whatever the reason may be, strong tutoring, or if they're a really motivated self-starter, working with the tests can get them very far on this test. But ultimately, for the vast majority of your students, being able to bridge the gap between the academic information that they have gathered, all these insights that they have about, not insights really isn't the word, the skills that they have in these different categories, and learning how to bridge them to the test is the key to getting the scores that reflect their ability, or more accurately reflect their ability, because a standardized test is never going to reflect them as an individual and the endless abilities that they have, right? In their uniqueness. But in order to succeed at these tests, it's essential that they get to know these tests. I hope this was incredibly helpful for you. I did my best to just put together the best of what I know about these tests. These are game changers for students. And the number of students I've had who come in and they say, "Oh, I'm not good at English. I'm not good at math. I'm not good at science." They just don't think they are. And students may have learned this when they were 4 years old already, or they believed it because somebody said something to them, and then they don't put in as much effort in those, because why would you try something that you don't think you're going to succeed at, right? And of course, in a coaching session with me, they're going to have the opportunity to they're going to have to try, right? They're going to have the question in front of them, and I acknowledge those fears. I'm like, okay, all right, well, here's the technique that we're going to use on this question. It's going to be different than perhaps you've seen in the class before. Let's try it. And once they start getting questions right, their brains start thinking, wait, was I maybe wrong? Maybe I can do this. And that's where you start to see the momentum build. And oh my gosh, it is the best feeling in the world when a student goes, oh my gosh, I think I like science. Or wait a second, I actually did really well on that. And oh, of course I'm getting emotional. We want students to thrive. And more than that, I just want, just like you want, these kids to have the best lives that they can. And these tests are meant to be tools. And I want each student, just like you want each student, to walk out of here. If the ACT or the SAT was an axe and they were going to go chop down the tree, we want them to have the best sharpened axe that they have to go chop down that tree. They all deserve it. And that's why I'm sharing this information with you, because students deserve to know that a so-called bad score on the test, first of all, is never, ever, ever a reflection on their ability to thrive in life. Even a good test score, it doesn't matter what your test score is. You can always thrive in life, right? Life is way more vast beyond a test score. But these test scores can unlock scholarships. They can unlock schools of their dreams with professors that are fantastic in classes. I mean, you know all these things, right? But I want them to know that if they got a score that they're frustrated about, or some part of their brain is telling them you don't have what it takes, this test isn't like the math test they just took in class. The reading was designed by the test writers, and it's totally logical that when you need to study for tests, right? You don't just, there's a reason you go to math class before you take the test. You gotta be prepared for it. You gotta learn what to expect. You gotta be familiar, or being familiar with your professor, with your teacher is so helpful, because it helps you know how to study and to then be prepared and to succeed. So thank you for empowering students and for empowering yourself. And I will see you next week. Well, see you, I guess, if you're watching the YouTube. Otherwise, I hope you will join me here next week on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And I look forward to sharing more insights to empower you and your students for those amazing lives that these kids are going out to build for themselves.